Welcome to part 2 of 4 in this lecture about decolonizing disability. This video will not make much sense if you haven't watched part 1, so if you haven't done that, I suggest you go do it now. As mentioned in part 1, the oppression of Indigenous people is inextricably intertwined with the oppression of people with disabilities. Based on my research, there are two primary ways this manifests. The first is that impairment is a product of colonialism. Decolonizing Indigenous Disability in Australia by David Hollinsworth discusses this idea within the context of settler Australia. It provides a historical overview of the colonization of Australia and shows the ways in which the state disables Aboriginal people through neglect and exclusion, which is compounded by sociological disadvantages like racism and poverty. Another article which engages with impairment as a product of colonialism is Decolonizing Disability, Thinking and Acting Globally by Helen Mikosha. This is what I would consider a key reading for this research. It is crucial to decolonizing Western disability studies and is referenced by several other articles I read during this research. Mikosha is discussing the different experiences of people with disabilities in the Global South versus the Global North. The Global South is made up of historically and currently colonized nations, while the Global North consists primarily of colonizing nations. Mikosha shows how colonialism produces impairment while also profiting from it through war and the arms trade, pollution, sweatshops, and the global disability market. Powerfully, she states that contemporary disability studies constitutes a form of scholarly colonialism, going on to say, maybe it is too confronting to deal with the continuing disabling of people in the Global South, because in trying to claim the positives of a disabled identity, it becomes difficult to acknowledge the overwhelming suffering that results from colonization, war, famine, and poverty. Thus, there exists an intellectual and political tension between pride, celebration, and prevention. This reflects a similar quote in the Hollinsworth article I mentioned in the previous slide. Hollinsworth states, "The work of decolonizing Indigenous disability in Australia demands a focus on contesting the dominant social model of disability based on an acknowledgement of our shared history of racism and recognition of the diversity of Indigenous perspectives on disability." Eugenics is the second way in which ableism and colonialism are deeply entangled with one another. Beginning in the late 19th century, eugenics was a popular Western movement to, quote, purify the white gene pool of, quote unquote, degenerate influences such as poverty, mental and physical disability, and racial impurities. Both Mikosha and Hollinsworth also engage with this entanglement of ableism and colonialism. Mikosha writes, "In colonial times, both disabled and racialized individuals were institutionalized to contain resistance and prevent the, quote, pollution of the wider population. Removal of children from family and community has for centuries been justified on the basis of disability, as has the removal of children on the basis of race and gender." In his article, Hollinsworth states, "The history of policies and practices towards Indigenous people in Australia has largely been one of neglect and exclusion. Although some periods reveal intense surveillance, incarceration for their own good, medicalization including the pathologizing of Indigenous cultures, lifestyles, and bodies, and eugenics through sterilization, or more often the control of sexuality. This history includes the impacts of colonial violence and neo-colonial power that imposed widespread impairments alongside disabling discourses of moral and physical inferiority. In other words, colonialism's production of impairment and its construction of the other as inferior go hand in hand. Anyone who has studied even a little critical Indigenous history will recognize these are trends not only in colonial Australia or the Global South, but also in the so-called United States and in the West in general." In part 3 of this lecture, we will discuss two Western models of disability and the Eurocentric values that underpin them.